Amazing. Welcome, everybody, to the Resilient Minds podcast. I'm excited today. I really am excited to spend time with a really amazing author and the leader in the Bitcoin space, Vijay Boyapati. Thank you for being here, brother. I appreciate you.
Thanks for having me, Eric. It's great to talk to you.
Likewise, brother. Honestly, I read your book and immediately I needed to reach out and just really take in the importance of not only your wisdom, but also more people I believe really needs to understand the fundamentals. But before we get into that, I'd love for you to share just a little bit of insight about, your background, your knowledge, how long you've been in the space, because I think that that's fundamental in how we move forward.
Yeah, so background briefly, I'm Australian. You might hear that in my accent. Moved to the US to do a PhD in computer science. So by training, I'm a computer scientist. Didn't end up doing the PhD, went and got a job, and ended up at Google when it was a much smaller company. It was a few hundred people. Spent my first few years of my career there. Then I left Google to do some political campaigning in the 2008 presidential election in the US. Campaigning for a political candidate named Ron Paul, who is a hero of mine. First guy to really talk about the importance of sound money, the impact it has on our civilization, and the detrimental impact it has when we have a fiat standard. That didn't work out, unfortunately, and I got to learn a little bit about the political process, and it was a bit of a shock to my system, and was a little bit dejected for a few years. But then came across Bitcoin in 2011, and because of my background in Austrian economics, I recognized it fairly quickly as a new form of money, and was absolutely fascinated by it, and spent many years going down the rabbit hole trying to understand what I think is the most important question in economics today, which is, how does Bitcoin have any value? That's a profoundly interesting, important question. This new form of money created out of thin air that has value on the market, has a price level. Not only does it have a price level, that the price level and the value of Bitcoin has been increasing steadily for over a decade now, and it's worth over $1 trillion, and it's continuing to grow. So this is something a lot of economists thought was impossible, that someone could create money out of thin air and that it becomes valuable in this way. So raised all sorts of questions for me, and for initially it was just kind of an economic curiosity. I wasn't smart enough to buy a bunch of it early on. I wish I had been. But I've just been thinking about this, obsessing about this for over a decade now, and trying to explain to other folks why this crazy new invention and innovation has value.
Mm. And what I love about this craziness, quote unquote, is that it's actually extremely sound and principle focused, which is what the most beautiful part of it is. And you talked about thin air, and I'm curious to think like the noise of money and the creating of thin air, right? With a level of disempowered principles versus the soundness or the signal of the principles and dynamics of truth and honesty. And so I'm excited to dive deep with you, brother. I really appreciate your insight because I do find that you're able to bring this economic framework at a very ground level to somebody that may not necessarily have any idea what the fuck is going on. And I think that this is really important because we can talk a lot of like technique or technical things and you know regenerative AI, and we can talk about all these different fundamentals. But I think that at the end of the day, the layman needs to be have an awareness of what is really happening. And I think that because you're such a master of Austrian economics, perhaps bringing that together with the economic framework of what Bitcoin brings, and also what has been manipulated in the current economy could be of a value as we kind of paint this picture for the next hour or so. Is that okay with you, bro?
Yeah, sounds great.
Cool. So what do you think, based off of kind of old uh, perspectives or paradigms, why do you think we created the old fiat standard, and the trend, and why didn't they take more of, maybe actually let's go into Austrian economics first and what it is. Maybe that's even more valuable.
Yeah, so economics is an interesting field where there are different schools of thought. And this is actually pretty unusual. There's not different schools of thought in physics or chemistry. There's no like Chicago School of Physics or Austrian School of Physics. It's just physics. But it's really a methodological question. How do you approach economics as a subject? How do you find economic truth? Do you treat economics as a deductive science, which is the Austrian approach, where you start with base axioms or beliefs about human nature, and they're very, very simple, basic assumptions that the basic foundation of Austrian economics is that man acts, that we use scarce resources to satisfy our subjective preferences. And this is pretty obvious. We do that. Everyone does that. And starting on that foundational assumption and reasoning deductively, we find economic truth. Or on the other hand, you treat economics sort of like a natural science, like physics, and you pretend to do experiments and pretend that they're repeatable and you can find certain laws of economics that way. The problem with that is that economics is not an empirical science, because you do not have repeatable experiments. You can conduct an experiment uh, in the Great Depression, but you can't repeat that experiment again and get the same sort of values, because the economy is fundamentally complex. Things are constantly changing. People's preferences are constantly changing. You can't do repeatable experiments in the same way that you can in the natural sciences. So I think it's pretty flawed assumption and methodology to treat economics as if it's a natural science. But that is basically what establishment economics does, and I think is the fundamental difference between Austrian economics and um, mainstream establishment economics.
Cool. So just so we're super clear, so the difference between there's establishment economics and there's Austrian economics, right? So now, if you could paint a real, like, what are the pros and cons from your perspective and your awareness of establishment economics and sorry, I'm laughing because I don't know if there's any, like, I don't know what the benefits could be, but anyways, like, and Austrian economics. So like, I'd love to get this kind of picture really clear, just so maybe there is, from a different narrative or a different perspective, this could be of value.
I think Austrian economics is great at revealing economic law, things that are true and are invariant across time. Um, I think establishment economics is all about finding correlations, things that are seemingly true, but really are just sort of statistical statements of a particular period of time. Like, we've established that so and so is true, but we just did some, empirical studies at this particular time with this group of people. So, for instance, a statement of economic law that you get from Austrian economics, which I think is invariant over time, is that if you increase the minimum wage that someone is guaranteed to be paid above the profitability that a company has in its business, this will increase unemployment. So if I was to increase the minimum wage to, say, $40, any business that had employees who were only producing, say, $10 of value per hour, they would have to lay those people off, and that would increase unemployment. So you can reason about this deductively. You don't need to do an empirical analysis to do this. And if you do an empirical analysis and it looks like the minimum wage was increased, but unemployment didn't go up, then that doesn't undermine the truth of that economic law. It just says that there are other factors involved at the same time. So Austrian economics, the statements of economic law that it produces are things like, if all things are held equal, an increase in the minimum wage will increase unemployment. So what it's doing is it's isolating a factor and telling you what the causal relationship of that factor is. You increase one thing, it'll result in another thing. Now, our economies are complex and there are a lot of things happening at the same time. Another way of thinking about this is like, imagine a forest fire. You light a match and you drop the match and it causes a forest fire. And the causal reason for the forest fire is the match. Now, someone else might, if you were a mainstream establishment type thinker, you'd say, well, actually, the wind is the reason for the fire, because when there was wind, the fire was bigger, and the more wind there was, the more fire there was. So it's the wind, that's the cause. An Austrian would say, no, that's not the cause is the match. So it's really about causality, trying to tease out economic causality, what causes what, and looking to our human motivation and human action as the underlying cause of economic phenomena.
Human action, love it. And inaction, it's interesting how you bring that to the next. You finish that. So when it comes to Austrian economics and establishment economics, how do you feel that now affects the human action, especially inside of, for example, our existing economy or banking, central banks, Federal Reserves, things like this?
How does the Federal Reserve affect people's actions? Is that the question?
No, how does human action based off of establishment economics versus Austrian economics affect the decisions of what's happening inside of these central banks? Or from your perspective, it doesn't need to, this is just from your perspective.
Um, I think an establishment economist would say that we need something like the Federal Reserve because human action needs to be guided, and that without guidance from a central planner, that you have chaos and you have cycles and recessions and unemployment, and you really need central management to prevent those things. I think an Austrian would tend to believe that free markets produce the best results. People making free decisions on their own for the benefit of themselves and their family and their communities. That is a system that produces the greatest wealth, reduces poverty over time, and gives people the greatest freedom. So that's typically the difference that you'd see in the mindset of someone who was a student of Austrian economics versus a student of mainstream stream economics.
Beautiful. So now thank you so much for this clarity. You're really painting it so simply, and it's amazing. And so now, as we have these established economics and Austrian economics, we have the central bank versus decentralized, or like the benefit of you. What is it now that you would say is how does the difference of the fiat standard and what does that mean to you versus the Bitcoin standard, and what does that mean to you, and how can that kind of compare with one another?
So the world, for most of its history, human civilization has had a hard money standard. That is, gold or something like gold was used as money, something that was hard to produce. And this is really important because money is like the foundational building block on which all trade and savings happens. It's like the measuring stick by which all transactions are happening, and you measure the value of whether you're being profitable, whether your business is profitable, is always measured against money. So the fiat standard, the big problem with the fiat standard is it politicizes this monetary standard. And instead of making it a very precise, dependable measuring stick for economic transactions, it makes it political. It makes it fuzzy. It makes it prone to swings in supply, and um, in general makes it much more difficult to measure the value of what you're getting. It's hard to know, for instance, in a country where they've had really savage inflation, um, whether the money you're getting is going to be worth anything tomorrow. So if you live in a place like Argentina or Zimbabwe, uh, your business makes some money, but are you profitable? It becomes hard to measure if you're profitable, because what is the value of the money that you're getting in? If it swings wildly, then it's really hard to tell. I have a story about this. I have a friend who was born in Argentina, and he told me that when he was a kid, when he would go to the grocery store, the person who put prices on the goods would move around the store and update the prices continuously, because the prices were increasing so rapidly that they had to update the prices. And and the problem with that is it just becomes really, really difficult to know, like, how much should I charge people? Because if I don't charge them enough, then the costs for me to acquire the goods are going to make it so my business is unprofitable. And it just means that that foundation, the monetary foundation, has been corrupted. And it's really hard to build an economic system on top of a corrupted foundation. What you have when that foundation gets corrupted is a breakdown in the division of labor. This happens in every society where you have a huge inflation and turning into a hyperinflation, is that the division of labor, which is the, most important thing to civilization, disappears. People who are doctors or teachers or policemen, they all start becoming speculators, because the value of their saving is depreciating so quickly, they have to speculate to keep their savings from disappearing under them. And so you lose that specialization in society. And when you don't have people who are specializing, you sort of revert back to an almost like barter-based society, which is very, very primitive. And this is seen in many countries that went through hyperinflation. The Weimar Republic, it's seen in Zimbabwe, seen in Argentina several times in the last century. It always puts society back to a very primitive state.
I love that you bring up the Weimar Republic, because just so anybody that's listening, when if you can share maybe a little bit about the Weimar Republic, because it and if from your perspective that's very similar to what might be happening now in terms of the inflation and how that's been shifting our economy. I'm just curious.
So the Weimar Republic was a republic that was formed after World War One, and the Allies imposed very punitive sanctions on um, on Germany that they couldn't they couldn't really pay. And the way the German Republic kind of got around this was, instead of paying, they just inflated their currency. And so they were paying back their debts in a currency that wasn't worth as much. It's very easy to print money. But the downside then is that you get hyperinflation, and the citizens of the country are, forced into poverty because of this. Uh, if a country has debts that cannot pay, typically the path of least resistance for central banks is to create more money, because it makes it easier to pay the debts. When you have a big debt burden, you can reduce the debt burden insidiously by creating more money. And so this is a problem of Western countries around the world. They've accumulated this massive debt burden. The United States, for instance, has a debt burden that's 130% of its gross national product. Um, and
How much did you say? Sorry, how much did you say?
130% of its gross domestic product, GDP. The problem is that that debt burden becomes difficult to service, right? You've got to pay interest on that debt. And eventually the interest payments become so large that you can't tax people enough to get enough revenue to pay those interest payments. And then you face a very difficult question. Do you default on the debt, which destroys the credit rating of the country? Um, or do you inflate the money supply so that the debt is easier to service? Usually countries will inflate the money supply. So these experiences of the past are, you know, they're looming large because it's with countries like the United States holding so much debt, it does seem like the path of least resistance over the next few years is going to be creating more money.
Interesting. So that brings me to credit. So does it mean that they're taking out more credit? And what I guess does that, if they're printing more money, does that mean they need more credit? Is like, explain. What are your thoughts here?
So the United States is running a large deficit, which means that it cannot fund its operations. So the United States pays for various things, the military and Social Security and Department of Education and FBI. It has all of these big departments that it has to pay for, and it doesn't have enough money to pay for them. So it taxes the US population, and the taxation isn't enough to fund uh, um, their spending. So the way they do that is they just accumulate debt. They go to the debt market and they sell debt, and they use the funds that they raise in the debt market to pay for the difference between what they, are able to pay and what they're actually spending. And so what that means is over time they're just accumulating the debt. The debt is going up and up and up. Um, the problem though is that there's interest on that debt. You have to currently the interest rate on the debt is the short term is around 5%, and on long term rates is around 4%. 4% on $30 trillion is what's the interest payment on that? That's probably like close to $1.5 trillion that the US has to pay. $1.5 trillion in interest payments. And the debt's not getting smaller, it's getting bigger. These deficits are being run every single year. Uh, and it doesn't seem like there's any political will from either side in the US. And this is true across all Western countries, I should say. It's not just the US. There isn't a political desire to fix this problem. It's just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And then you have a moment of crisis at some point in the future where the bond market probably doesn't want to fund the US anymore. So what happens then? That's the question. I think that's when you get a moment of like hyperinflation that you've seen in past examples like the Weimar Republic, where the government says we need to fix this problem. The only way we can fix it is by printing a lot more money.
So this is something very similar to what happened just before World War II in the Weimar Republic.
Just after World War One in the Weimar
Just
Republic, I think there are definitely certain similarities between the two. And other episodes of hyperinflation, you have the precursors where you have an increasing debt burden, um, and it's just not being addressed. They didn't address it in the Weimar Republic. They didn't find a structural solution which said, we have this massive debt obligation that we owe to the Allies. How do we fix this? How do we structure it in a way that can be paid? I mean, these questions are sort of similar to questions of individuals too, right? It's possible for a person to go into so much credit card debt they can't pay it back, and then they have to go into bankruptcy. They have to figure out a way to restructure their lives, to spend less, to save more. Um, and this is exactly the same idea with nation states. It's just that nation states don't seem to have the same level of responsibility as individuals. And the political dynamic in these countries is such that a solution is almost impossible to find.
fascinating. So when it comes to, and it's interesting because yet there's always a solution to pay for, what did you say? There's like the CIA, the FBI, the all the wars. There's always a solution there, right? But yet the same people that we're actually wanting to take care of within these borders, there's a struggle or there's a way to tax them. That's what I'm hearing.
Yeah,
I don't know.
yeah. So there are a couple of problems. One is it's hard to wind back spending.
Mhm.
Because once you've promised people that they're going to get benefits of one sort or another, it's very politically difficult to say, actually, we need to cut that. It's almost, I would say it's politically impossible to reduce Social Security in the US. It's a topic that no politician wants to touch because uh, explaining the truth to the American people and saying, hey, we can't actually afford this, so we're going to cut back your benefits is really difficult. People will not vote for someone who tells the truth. And so the incentives here are not aligned to finding a solution. Um, it's much easier to tell people as a politician, hey, I'm just going to give you more benefits and push the can down the road and say this isn't my problem. This is a problem for the next generation of politicians. Eventually, the problem becomes so big that it can't be solved, and the system itself just implodes.
So we talk a lot about the U.S., and I think that this is uh, also something somewhat happening in the EU. And do you mind sharing a little bit about what you're have seen also in the EU, and maybe even in Australia, maybe there's things that you're seeing, or these patterns are repeating themselves in different major economies around the world, really affecting our global economy.
I think this is a problem that exists across almost all Western countries to greater or lesser extents. I'd say the US in some ways is kind of average. It's not like the worst, it's not the best. Um, if I was trying to pick a country that's in a really bad shape, I would say it's Japan. Uh, Japan's debt to its GDP level is one of the highest in the Western world. And they have very low interest rates in Japan, and they can't really increase those interest rates because if they increase them, the interest rate in Japan is close to 0%. If they were to increase that rate of interest, um, even to 2 or 3%, then they would not be able to service their debt anymore. The government would no longer be able to service its debt. So, um, yeah, it is a problem across the world. And it seems like there is no country which is confronting it. It doesn't seem like there's a political will to confront it, at least anywhere that I have seen.
What are you seeing in because I hear too, like, a lot of EU regulations, and I don't know, like, have you heard of any of these EU regulations? Because I know, like, maybe mutual friends of ours are going up against a lot of this EU regulation against the Bitcoin standard, that things are actually trying to limit that ability for people to actually step up to that level of integrity, because how credit and Bitcoin compare with each other. So maybe if you can touch on what credit and how it compares to the Bitcoin system, uh, before we go into the EU side of things. Because actually, hold on, I'll take us back a moment, because I apologize. Perhaps the Bitcoin standard, maybe illuminating a small understanding of what that really means to you would be great.
A Bitcoin standard to me uh, means a world where I can trust that my savings are safe,
Hmm.
that the time I spend, the fruit of my labor is safe, and that I can transmit it through time and space safely. Um, I don't have that now. I don't have the ability to I don't have the belief that if I keep my savings in dollars, or if I lived in Europe in euros, that I could keep it safely through time. And also through space. I think that's another thing. If I want to transmit my money or my value to someone on the other side of the world, I don't want to have to ask permission. It's my savings. It's what I earned through my hard work. I should have the freedom to be able to give it to whoever I want without the permission of the banking system. So to me, a Bitcoin standard is a world that's much freer. It's a more prosperous world. It's a world where people have the incentive to work hard and to specialize and to become good at something. And it's a world with a lot less speculation. A lot less people gambling on the stock market. Uh, just constantly looking for ways to uh, prevent their savings from melting away, because that's a common problem across the globe. Is like, when I save money, what do I do with it? I need to think about what I do with it. On a sound money standard, you don't have to worry about that. You keep your savings in money, and you don't have to worry because money keeps its value and it increases in value over time. Like under the gold standard, people, when they saved in gold coins, they saved in money. And the idea of keeping your savings in money wasn't crazy at all. But now, if you're someone who earns a lot of money, say you're a doctor or a lawyer, the idea of keeping what you earn in dollars is absolutely insane, because all of that hard work that you put in to create that wealth melts away every single year through inflation. Uh, so regular people who should be specializing and becoming masters of their craft and becoming valuable because they're so talented at a particular thing, their attention is being drawn away to do things which really they shouldn't be wasting their time on.
Profound and interesting that the most valuable thing that we really do have is our time and our energy. And so how do we start to protect that level of responsibility and create a even more empowering future for our next generation, so that we take more responsibility? Because from what I'm hearing, it sounds like to me that our predecessors have chosen not to take responsibility and continue to pass that on moving forward regularly, so on and so forth, to really to us to take responsibility of it.
Yeah, this has been a problem that's been growing for a long time. This isn't necessarily a new problem. And if I would point out a particular point in time that this really started to accelerate, it would have been the early 1970s. And that's when the US left the gold standard fully and permanently. And so there was no more leash on the creation of credit. Um, and that's when the supply and the supply of money and the increase in the US debt level really started to balloon. Um, so yeah, I think this is a long-standing issue, but it can't go on forever. I think we're closer to the end than the beginning of the fiat standard. And the fiat standard is really a historical anomaly. Most of human history, we did not use fiat money. This is actually very strange. I think it's a relatively brief moment in history between the gold standard and the Bitcoin standard, and I call it the fiat money interregnum. It's like this brief interlude before we get back to hard money again.
Profound. I like that. That's really a good point. And at the end of the day, the money has always been you pass down from generation to generation, but the real wealth is who we are, is how we show up, is what we create, is how we start to move forward. And it's like we can pass our intelligence on to the next generation. And now I believe through the digital gold or the digital money, you know, Bitcoin, we can pass on, our level of knowledge and wisdom to our next generation, something that is going to be left without it being eaten up, or like our predecessors or our grandfathers, have worked so hard and then ended up with being taxed with everything, before we can even get any of the inheritance. And so I think that there's a huge layer of nuances that we're really refining as we build this future. And I think, the EU, it's really important that we as a community can step up to the standards of like helping to challenge, not, and maybe not just in the EU. I really believe that the regulators are having a difficult time there, or creating a difficult time there. But like, what do you feel that we can do as a community to really challenge more uh, the regulation, but also stepping up as leaders inside of the Bitcoin community, that believe in something greater than ourselves, so that we can make sure that our system starts to create this Bitcoin standard, this permissionless opportunity of true freedom and truth. integration into our current realities?
I think education is a really big component. So I think what you're doing is a real help, Eric, educating people and helping them understand the importance of Bitcoin, the importance of sound money, why it's important that you should be able to keep the fruits of your labor, and why inflation is so insidious. Most people don't understand these things at all. They don't think about it. They just kind of take it for granted that the money they have or the monetary system is there for a good reason. Uh, Most people haven't even begun to go down the rabbit hole on what money is, why it's valuable, where does it come from. I think exposing them that to that idea is really important. Uh, it takes time though. A lot of people are not ready to hear that, and a lot of people don't care about it. Many people don't have that realization until it's too late, and they have lost a lot of value or money uh, to inflation or through bad government mismanagement, or they end up in their country ends up like Zimbabwe or Argentina, and then they really have to think about it. Um, I think that there is a place for political advocacy as well, lobbying members of your government and telling them that you support policies that are pro-Bitcoin. Um, I think a lot more politicians are receptive to this now because Bitcoin is one of those issues where it's kind of attractive as a politician to say positive things about Bitcoin because the people who care about Bitcoin really care about it, and the rest of the people are kind of apathetic. They don't have an opinion either way. Uh, I actually think it's pretty detrimental for politicians like Elizabeth Warren in the US who are fighting against Bitcoin because the demographic of people who really are anti-Bitcoin is pretty tiny. There aren't that many people out there who feel passionately that Bitcoin needs to be killed or should be regulated to death. Um, so taking that position is, I think, less politically attractive than taking the position of I'm pro-Bitcoin and I want to create policies that are pro-Bitcoin. So I think speaking to politicians and advocating for pro-Bitcoin policies is helpful because it shows them that there is this incentive, that it is beneficial to take those policy positions and to support Bitcoin.
Do you see as we transition into, a new monetary standard, uh, what do you see that timeline look like, based off of your perspective? And do you think that, how will that affect our institutional behaviors? So, for example, the government, politicians, do you see that shifting in any way?
My, I think the process of Bitcoin becoming the world's global reserve currency is a multi-decade process. In my book, I say that I think Bitcoin will be the world's monetary base in 50 years. Um, it's going to take some time, and I know people get excited and think it's just around the corner, but I think, that there will be markers along the way to say that we're getting there. And one of them will be Bitcoin supplants gold as, the non-sovereign global store of value. People recognize that gold is a store of value, and it's still very valuable. Gold is like 13 times more valuable than Bitcoin. So it's worth a lot. But I think probably in the not too distant future, I would give it in, the next 5 years or so, 5 to 10 years, Bitcoin's going to pass gold. And then I think it's going to be adopted by nation states. And I think uh, that process is going to be difficult. There's going to be a lot of pushback. Nation states are not, especially the US, is not going to like it because the United States loses a lot of its geopolitical influence by not having the reserve currency. The reserve currency being dollars gives the United States a lot of power. So there will be pushback, and that's kind of why I think the process is going to extend out for a long time. It really needs to be established as a form of savings for the general population of the world. And once that happens, I think it becomes inevitable. Governments can't fight it anymore because everyone will be saving in Bitcoin. And when everyone is saving in Bitcoin, it is just naturally global money, and governments will have to be they'll be forced to adopt it as their own currencies.
So I'm curious to understand, what do you think that needs to speed up that behavior? Because I really don't see, I mean, the fiat standard being a valuable condition for the next 5 decades. So I would love to have your perspective. I believe it can be faster. It just needs to. It's about taking more of us being responsible in that essence, and really having the right people behind it, and integrate that with the way more curiosity, knowledge, wisdom, but also then integration, and how does that being implemented into the existing ecosystem, or acquiring business and organizational behaviors that are then integrating the Bitcoin standard. So I'm curious to know, besides, what you're like, especially coming from your background, what do you think that we can do to integrate it at a more uh, quicker approach?
Uh, I should say I tend to be a little bit pessimistic about these things, and I think that maybe when I say 50 years, I could be being pessimistic, maybe faster than that. Um, I like to be conservative because I think it's too wishful thinking to think this is going to happen in the next few years. To accelerate it, I would say really individually what we can do is just adopt Bitcoin as the Bitcoin standard for ourselves. And a lot of people have already done that. And what I mean by that is that you measure your savings in how much Bitcoin you have. You don't care as much like how much fiat you have. You're not measuring your wealth in fiat terms, you're measuring it in Bitcoin terms. And that can really, I mean, I've seen this in so many people. It really transforms the way people live. Um, I think once people understand what Bitcoin is, that it's the most scarce asset that's ever existed, and that it's growing in adoption, so it has this tendency to grow in value, and that its supply is strictly limited, they become desperate to increase their stack. What I mean by that is not desperate to increase the fiat value of their stack, but desperate to increase the number of satoshis they have, or the number of bitcoins they have, and it changes people's behavior. I have seen so many people have gone from, sort of spendthrift, irresponsible living to becoming very responsible savers who try to figure out like what expenses can I cut out of my life that I don't need, that are just frivolous and unnecessary, and I want to live a more frugal life so that I can save more Bitcoin. I've seen this in so many people, to know that there's something here, that Bitcoin can be transformative on an individual level, not just a societal level, to make individuals more responsible, to make them want to save more, to make them think about the future more, to plan forward and um, to have a plan for their family. Like, how do I get as much of this asset as possible, this new form of money that's better than any money that humanity has ever seen, for my children and for my grandchildren. And that's something I find really exciting, is that individual transformation that I've seen in so many people.
I love that. And I think that the more of us individually get curious about it, the more, as a result, organizations and businesses will start to adopt it. And I think that right now, with like even a lot of the layer two, applications that are happening, it is going to become easier for businesses to accept Bitcoin. Am I right?
Yeah, I think so. One thing I would say that I have a different opinion on here, and I had lots of arguments with folks who were very um, pro evangelizing businesses to adopt Bitcoin early on in, say, 2015 to 2017. I argued that that was kind of putting the cart before the horse. Businesses don't yet have a strong incentive to adopt Bitcoin because you need the population as a whole to save in Bitcoin and to have savings in Bitcoin so that they have something to spend. Like, if you're a baker and only like 1% of your clientele has savings in Bitcoin, there isn't a huge incentive to figure out like a payment system to take Bitcoin or to save in Bitcoin yourself, because you're just not seeing it in your customers. This is why I think it's much more important to encourage people in general to save in Bitcoin. The businesses will flow naturally once Bitcoin is widely distributed in the population.
So I have a different perspective, and I'd love to get your idea on it. I believe that as a result, because there is such a natural flow of bigger organizations, corporate culture, and things like this, that if they apply and implement a Bitcoin standard within their ecosystem, they can start paying and integrating that level of communication inside of their organization, and as a result, it empowers their team to then get paid with the Bitcoins as well, and then use that across different organizations. And then if they're accepting that as well, it encourages people to say, hey, like the only way that we really are willing to work with you, or this is an opportunity for us to work with you, is by paying us with Bitcoin. And I think at a fundamental level, it brings a lot of different organizational responsibility and changes the culture from a higher perspective, meaning that it's inside of these, because they're small communities, basically, if you think of each bigger organization. And then as a result, they get to impact their immediate community by paying them on the Bitcoin standard, by themselves adopting it, so that then they can pay them. And then as a result, it creates this internal ecosystem and more of a circular economy. But then in addition to that, then the people within that ecosystem or community can go out to these other, and they get more educated because their CEO or their leader has decided to adopt a new way to encourage his community or communities or ecosystem to support. And so what are your thoughts on this? I'm curious.
I think that just in my experience, my observation, this works if the management or the leadership of the company has already been orange pilled. It's very hard to do this. So MicroStrategy and Michael Saylor is a good example of this. He orange pilled himself, and in the case of MicroStrategy, he has a lot of executive power in that company. Some companies, they don't actually have a lot of executive power. A lot of power is in the board of the company, and it's hard for the CEO to make unilateral decisions like, hey, I want to, like, Tim Cook is probably a good example of this. He's the CEO of Apple. It would be very difficult for him to unilaterally just say, hey, we're doing everything on Bitcoin now, because he would need to consult with the board. He doesn't have that unilateral control that Michael Saylor does, and he's not orange pilled as well. So my perspective is this has been pretty rare for this kind of thing to happen. I do think it will happen, but it needs to happen from a sort of more organic, ground up, customer demand situation where customers are like, hey, I've got money and I have a lot of my savings in Bitcoin and I want to spend them. Like, I want to come to Apple and buy stuff with Bitcoin. If Apple had enough of its customers knocking on its door saying, I want to buy my iPhone with Bitcoin, they would adopt Bitcoin. The problem is it's just not widely adopted enough. Like, the number of people on Earth who own Bitcoin is probably still in the ballpark of 1 to 2% of the world's population. It's still a tiny fraction of global adoption. So we still have a lot of growing to do.
I love it, and I totally agree with you. I think being able to integrate and purchase products, especially with what $150 billion on the balance sheet in cash at Apple, it would probably create a really great opportunity and responsibility inside of that organization to then build the ecosystem. But then, as a result, also going into Apple and buying these at a company level, right? Being able to go and purchase, I think that there's an opportunity where we can really integrate at that organizational capacity. So I see a huge opportunity and a great solution here, and I'm excited to continue to integrate this with a lot of insight and growth. So then, as a result, more people, whether they have a board or not, are recognizing that it is in benefit of their organization. It is in benefit of the people that are inside of that organization, and it is in benefit of us as a whole, because at the end of the day, we're all just mirrors of each other here to support each other at the highest level. So this is exciting news to hear from you, brother, and I tremendously really appreciate your wisdom, your knowledge, your insight. It really meant a lot to me, bro.
It's my pleasure, Eric. It's great speaking with you.
Likewise, brother. Um, if anybody wants to find out more about you and the amazing book, The Bullish Case for Bitcoin, you know, please, first of all, anybody who wants to read that book is amazing. I loved it. If you think that there's brilliance here in this conversation, just check out the book. It will really guide you in a great direction. But in addition to that, my brother, please, Vijay, tell us what we can do to find out more information, what you're up to, how people, if they want to reach out and work with you, what is the best way to connect?
Yeah, probably the best place to connect with me is on Twitter, or I should say X, now. And I'm real_Vijay, so REAL_VIJAY. And you'll find me on Twitter. I talk about Bitcoin a lot. I'm really excited about Bitcoin and how it's going to change our world and make the world a better place for my kids. So yeah, find me on X.
I love it, brother. Thank you so much. And if you had, I have one last question. If you had 3 days left to live, what would you do?
3 days left to live. What would I do? I think I would spend every minute of it with my family, with my kids and my wife, and just how amazing they are, and tell them how much I love them. And just spend every minute being with them. Even just the little things like reading my kids a book makes me happy. So I think that's how I'd spend it.
You're a blessing, brother. Thank you so much for your time.
Of course. Thanks, Eric.